He arrived early that morning, before anyone else had come to the hall. The building was quiet, filled with the faint scent of old wood and dust, the kind of smell that made him think of decades gone by. He had worked here for years, quietly sweeping floors, emptying trash bins, and repairing little things that others ignored. Most people hardly noticed him, and he liked it that way. He liked moving through the shadows, unnoticed, because it gave him peace. He liked listening to the echoes of his own footsteps in the empty hall. It reminded him of something he had lost long ago. No one ever thought of him as more than a janitor. Some people even looked down on him, imagining that he was uneducated, simple, or unimportant. They whispered about him, laughed when he wasn't around, and dismissed him whenever he tried to speak. He never minded their opinions. In truth, he had learned long ago that respect wasn't something people gave freely, was something you earned quietly, with patience, without needing an audience. But deep down, he knew he carried something within him that others could never understand, something hidden behind his quiet eyes and the worn clothes he wore to blend in. The old hall was a place of history. Its wooden floors creaked underfoot, its high ceilings held a kind of reverent air, and in the corner, tucked away like an old secret, stood a grand piano. It was dusty, its keys yellowed with age, and the finish was dull from years of neglect. Most people ignored it. It had not been played in years, except by a few old musicians who had long since stopped coming. He often found himself standing near it during his shifts, running his fingers lightly over the keys when no one was watching. He had learned to move silently, to listen to the soft echo of notes bouncing against the walls, and to let the music speak in a way words never could. No one knew he had once been a pianist. Once, long before he had taken this job, he had played in large concert halls filled with people who had clapped and cheered for him. But life had a way of turning even the most beautiful melodies into silence. Tragedy had swept through his world, leaving him with memories he carried like a heavy weight. He had walked away from that life, choosing a quiet corner where he could live unnoticed, where he could work with his hands, and where he could play only when no one was around to see. His music was private now, a secret that he cherished. That morning, he moved through the hall with a routine that had become almost ritualistic. He pushed the mop across the floor in slow, even strokes, careful not to make too much noise. He dusted the chairs, straightened the tables, and fixed a loose light bulb in the corner. Everything had its place, and he made sure it stayed that way. The sound of the mop sliding over the polished wood echoed faintly like the prelude to a silent symphony. He paused for a moment and looked toward the piano. Its presence always seemed to fill the room, even when it was silent. It was as if it were waiting for something, waiting for someone to remember its voice. By mid-morning, the first group of people started arriving. They were performers and organizers, talking loudly, carrying instruments, adjusting lights, and rehearsing lines. Most ignored him entirely, assuming he would be quietly moving around in the background. Some barely nodded when he passed. Others gave a polite smile before returning to their business. One or two muttered under their breath about how slow he was, how he moved too carefully, how he didn't belong in the bustle of the event. He did not respond. He never responded. He had learned that arguments never won hearts, and that people who mocked others only revealed their own weaknesses. Among the crowd was a woman who seemed determined to dominate the room. She moved with confidence, her heels clicking against the floor as she surveyed everything like she owned it. Her eyes flicked toward him briefly, and he noticed the faint smirk on her face. She whispered something to one of her colleagues, and both laughed. He caught a few words, wasting time and just a janitor. He felt a twinge of annoyance, but it was small, almost imperceptible. He had grown used to sneers and insults. They rolled off him like water on glass. Still, there was something in her tone, sharpness that made him tighten his jaw ever so slightly. He moved toward the corner where the piano stood. No one expected him to touch it, and that was exactly how he liked it. He brushed off the thick layer of dust on the lid, revealing the smooth, worn wood beneath. He lifted the lid slowly, as if unveiling a long-forgotten treasure, and ran his fingers lightly over the keys. The sound that came out was soft, hesitant, almost as if testing the air. It wasn't loud enough to reach the bustling crowd in the hall, but it was enough to make him smile. That sound reminded him who he was, even if no one else knew. It reminded him that some parts of him had never been broken, no matter how the world tried. The woman noticed him then, moving toward the piano with curiosity and a hint of mockery. "Oh, so he actually plays?" she said loudly, enough for others to hear. "I thought he just liked pressing buttons." The people around her laughed, some politely, some cruelly. He did not respond. He simply rested his hands on the keys and continued to play softly. But now her tone changed. She leaned closer, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Go on, show us. Play something real. I dare you." The hall seemed to hold its breath. He felt the weight of eyes on him, but he did not falter. He had faced ridicule before, and he knew that people like her craved attention more than truth. His hands stayed steady on the keys, feeling the smoothness of each one. He began to play a few simple notes, testing the familiar movements. He could sense her growing impatience, the way she tapped her foot, the way her colleagues whispered behind her hand. She expected him to fail. She expected him to stumble and confirm her assumptions. But he had learned long ago that the most powerful statements were made without words. As he continued, soft melody began to fill the space, even if only slightly. A few people stopped what they were doing to listen. Some were curious, some were confused, and some were quietly moved. The woman, however, only laughed and rolled her eyes. She had not yet realized that music could speak louder than words, and that someone who seemed ordinary could hold extraordinary power. He did not play for her. He played for himself, for the memories, for the quiet parts of life that most people never noticed. And in doing so, he reminded himself that nothing, not mockery, not time, not tragedy, could ever take that away from him. The morning went on. People came and went, carrying their instruments, checking schedules, and preparing for the event. He continued his work, cleaning, arranging, fixing, and occasionally playing soft notes on the piano when no one looked. He moved like a shadow, present but unnoticed. A silent guardian of a space that belonged to more than just the performers and organizers. The piano was his companion, the only one who did not judge, the only one who listened. By the time the hall began to fill with the first official guests, he had finished his morning tasks. He stepped back for a moment, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked around. The room was alive now, with chatter, music, and activity, but he felt a calm inside. He knew that sooner or later, the woman would push too far. She always did. She had to be the center of attention, to dominate, to mock anyone who seemed beneath her. But he did not fear her. He had faced far worse than arrogance and sneers. He had faced silence, loss, and emptiness, and he had survived. If she wanted a show, he would give her one. But it would be on his terms, and she would not be prepared. He walked quietly toward the back of the hall, his eyes occasionally flicking to the piano. It seemed to gleam faintly under the morning light, as if aware of what was to come. He did not know exactly when the moment would arrive or how the crowd would react. He only knew that he had something inside him that could not be silenced, something that could not be ignored. And when the time came, he would let it speak. For now, he worked in silence. He swept the floor with long, deliberate strokes, wiped the surfaces clean, and adjusted chairs that had been left crooked. He moved with a rhythm of his own, a quiet choreography that made the hall seem almost alive. The people around him continued their rehearsals, unaware of the story unfolding quietly in the corner, and he was content with that. He did not need an audience. Not yet. The hall was bustling now, full of voices, instruments, and the constant shuffle of feet on the polished floor. People moved in every direction, preparing for the rehearsal that was to come. He stayed in the background, sweeping quietly, straightening chairs, and checking the edges of the stage. Every now and then, his gaze flicked toward the piano. He had spent countless mornings in this very spot, feeling the pull of the keys beneath his fingers, the quiet promise of music that could speak louder than any words. But today felt different. There was an energy in the room he had not felt before, an anticipation that seemed to ripple through the walls. She entered the hall not long after him, her presence commanding attention without effort. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor, cutting through the hum of conversation like a warning. She surveyed the space with sharp eyes, her lips curling into a faint smirk. It was clear she believed she ruled every room she entered. She stopped briefly near the piano, glancing at him as he bent over his mop. "Oh, so he actually works here," she said, loud enough for others to hear. Her voice carried a mix of amusement and condescension, the kind that made people around her laugh quietly. He did not look up. He kept sweeping, letting the sound of the mop against the floor keep him grounded. He had learned long ago that responding to people like her never changed anything. Words were often weapons for those who lacked skill or understanding. The piano, however, required no explanation. Its voice, its sound, could convey truth more clearly than any argument. She moved closer, leaning slightly toward him. "I didn't think a janitor could do much," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe you should stick to cleaning. Or are you secretly going to show us something?" She laughed, and her laughter was sharp and high-pitched, echoing off the walls. A few of her friends joined in, some nodding, some whispering comments, all clearly amused at what they believed was his inferiority. He stopped for a moment, placing the mop aside. His hands brushed against the worn wood of the piano, fingers hovering above the keys. He could feel the weight of her eyes, the pressure of her mockery, yet he did not flinch. Instead, he let himself breathe, letting the familiar smell of the polished wood fill him with calm. There was something almost ritualistic in this preparation, a quiet confidence that had been honed over years of practice and silence. "Go on," she said now, leaning against a table. "Play something. Show us that you're not just some nothing." Her smirk widened as she said the last word. She waved her hand in a challenging gesture, as if daring him to prove her wrong. The others laughed. Some whispered among themselves, teasing, questioning, and enjoying the spectacle they imagined was about to unfold. He looked at her finally, and for the first time that morning, their eyes met. He did not smile. He did not speak. There was a calmness there, a stillness that she had not anticipated. For the first time she hesitated. There was no fear, no uncertainty in his gaze, only a quiet strength. Something she had never seen in anyone she considered beneath her. Without a word, he seated himself at the piano. The bench creaked slightly under his weight, and the room seemed to pause. He opened the lid carefully, brushing off the last layer of dust that clung to the keys. Then he rested his fingers lightly on the keyboard, feeling the familiar resistance beneath his touch. The hall, which had been filled with noise just moments before, began to fall silent. People sensed that something was about to happen, though none of them could guess what. The first notes were soft, tentative, almost shy. They were not meant to fill the hall, only to test the air, to prepare it for what was coming. His hands moved with precision and care, each note deliberate, each pause intentional. The melody grew slowly, and with it, the attention of the room. People stopped moving, stopped whispering, and turned their heads toward the piano. Even the woman who had mocked him found herself pausing, her laughter caught in her throat. She watched him with growing disbelief. Her smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. The music was different from what she expected. It was not flashy, not designed to show off. It was honest, full of feeling and impossible to ignore. Each note carried weight, each chord spoke of something deeper than skill. It spoke of life, of pain, of quiet triumphs and losses that no one in the room could understand fully. The people around her began to shift. Subtly at first, a few leaned forward, their elbows resting on chairs, eyes fixed on the man at the piano. Some felt tears welling up in their eyes, though they did not understand why. There was something raw and human in the music, something that spoke directly to their hearts. The air in the hall seemed to change, charged with emotion, thick with anticipation. She tried to laugh again, to break the tension, but it came out hollow. The laughter of her friends died quickly, replaced by silence. She felt a strange feeling, one she had never experienced before. It was as if the music had reached inside her, bypassing all her defenses, all her confidence, and laid bare the arrogance she had worn like armor. She shifted uneasily, her arms crossing instinctively, as if to protect herself from something intangible. Meanwhile, he continued to play, unaware of the exact effect he was having. He was not playing to win or to teach a lesson. He was playing because it was what he had always done, because it was a part of him that could not be taken away. Each chord was a story, each pause a breath of memory. He remembered long nights in grand halls, the applause of strangers, the quiet moments of solitude after performances when only the music remained. That memory flowed through his fingers, filling the hall with a depth of emotion that was impossible to ignore. The woman's friends began to exchange glances. Some whispered softly, others stayed frozen in place, unable to look away. There was a growing awareness in the room that this man was not what they thought. Their assumptions, their mockery, were crumbling under the weight of the music. And she, who had been so certain of her superiority, felt a shift inside herself. She could not name it, could not control it, but she felt small. Caught off guard by the undeniable truth of what she was hearing, he moved into a section of the music that was more deliberate, more commanding. The notes rang out clearly now, echoing against the high ceilings, filling the corners of the hall where shadows had once lingered. The audience, small at first, but growing as people returned to see what was happening, began to watch in awe. Some held their breath. Others felt a lump form in their throat. Even the staff who had once ignored him could not look away. He was no longer just a janitor. He was a force that demanded attention without asking for it. Her face, once so confident, now betrayed a mixture of disbelief and unease. She realized that she had misjudged him entirely. She had assumed that mockery and arrogance could define someone, that appearances were truth. But here, in this moment, that illusion had shattered. She could feel the weight of the music pressing against her, pulling at memories, at feelings she had buried deep. Her laughter had been an attempt to hide insecurity. And now, faced with genuine talent, she had nothing to hide behind. He did not look at her. He did not need to. The music spoke for him more powerfully than any words could. Each note was precise, yet full of human imperfection, the kind that made it real. It was not meant to impress with speed or complexity. It was meant to be felt, to touch something inside the listener that they could not name. And it did. The hall, once filled with noise and movement, was now united in silence. Caught in the spell of a melody that transcended everyday life, time seemed to stretch. The seconds passed differently in the presence of this music. People forgot to breathe fully. Their thoughts slowed. Their minds, usually filled with gossip, planning, and judgment, now only contained the sound that filled the space. It was as if the piano had woven an invisible thread through everyone's hearts, binding them together in a shared experience that none could resist. And she, who had mocked him so cruelly, could not move. Her arms were still crossed, her lips pressed tight, her eyes wide. She wanted to speak, to regain control, to mock again, but no words came. She could not break the connection the music had formed, could not resist its truth. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that was unfamiliar and uncomfortable. And that was precisely the point. The janitor played on, his hands moving with ease and authority. Each passage of music told a story of loss, of longing, of quiet determination. He remembered the struggles he had faced, the nights of solitude, the moments when he had wondered if anyone would ever understand his gift. And now, in the quiet of the hall, with the eyes of those who had doubted him upon him, he played not for revenge, not for recognition, but simply because it was who he was. As the final notes of the piece lingered in the air, the hall remained silent. People blinked as if waking from a dream. Some let out small, stunned breaths. Some felt tears slipping down their cheeks, though they did not understand why. The woman who had mocked him finally moved, stepping back slowly, her confidence shaken. She had been wrong. She had assumed too much. She had believed that appearance and attitude could define a person. Now she knew differently. He stood slowly, closing the piano lid with care. His eyes met hers briefly, and there was no gloating, no triumph. Only calm, only quiet strength. The lesson had been given, but without cruelty. He did not need to prove himself further. The music had spoken, and it had spoken louder than any words ever could. People began to murmur softly, some approaching him, some exchanging looks of awe. The woman, still frozen in place, felt a deep shift inside herself. She had been shown something she could not ignore, something that demanded respect. And for the first time, she understood that judgment based on appearances was a dangerous thing. That true talent and depth often hid where no one thought to look. He returned to his duties quietly, picking up the mop once more. But now, the room saw him differently. No longer just a janitor, he was someone who carried a world within him, someone whose music could silence arrogance and command attention without a single word. The morning had started like any other, with whispers and laughter at his expense. But it ended with a lesson that none would forget, a reminder that true power lies not in mockery or status, but in the quiet confidence of knowing who you are and never letting the world take it from you. The morning had grown brighter, like sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the hall, cutting across the dusty floor in sharp golden lines. He moved quietly, almost invisible, carrying a bucket and mop as he began his usual rounds. The air smelled faintly of polish and old wood, and the occasional echo of footsteps from the upper floors reminded him how empty the building could feel when no one was around. Most days were simple. He would sweep dust and fix small things, and the world would go on, oblivious to his existence. He had accepted that, but today was different. There was a tension in the hall he could feel in his bones. People were arriving earlier than usual, carrying instruments, adjusting microphones, and chatting in clusters that buzzed with energy. The performers were loud, confident, and sometimes careless. Some of them glanced at him as he worked, but most assumed he was invisible, a part of the scenery rather than a person. He did not mind. He had long ago perfected the art of being unseen, of moving in the background while keeping his own thoughts and feelings intact. Then she entered. The sound of her heels clicking sharply against the floor drew attention immediately. She carried herself as if the hall belonged to her, her chin slightly raised, her eyes scanning everything with a quiet judgment. She noticed him almost immediately, his careful movements, the way he avoided stepping on the sunlight on the floor. She raised an eyebrow and whispered something to a colleague, just loud enough for a few people nearby to hear. A few chuckled quietly, and her smirk grew. He kept working. He did not look at her. His hands moved rhythmically, sweeping the floor in long, even strokes. The motions were almost meditative. The mop glided across the wood, each stroke echoing faintly against the walls. He could feel the pull of the piano in the corner, its presence a silent invitation. It had been years since anyone had paid attention to it, yet its voice waited patiently, ready to speak again. "Look at him," she said suddenly, her voice carrying easily across the hall. "Do you really think someone like that can do anything but clean?" She laughed, sharp and loud, her laughter cutting through the low hum of conversation. "I bet he's never even touched a real piano in his life." A few of her friends laughed too, some out of amusement, others out of fear of being left out. She looked back at him, challenging him without even moving closer. "Go on, play something." "I dare you." The words were meant to humiliate. The laughter was meant to wound. But he did not react in the way she expected. There was no flinch, no rush of embarrassment. Instead, he paused for a moment, resting his hand lightly on the handle of the mop, then slowly placed it aside. He walked over to the piano, his steps measured and calm. The room seemed to sense a shift, though most did not understand why. Even the sunlight streaming across the floor seemed to dim slightly. As if waiting for what was about to happen, he lifted the lid of the piano with care, brushing away the fine layer of dust that had settled over the keys. His fingers hovered just above them, feeling the cold, smooth surface. He did not rush. Each motion was deliberate. The hall, once buzzing with movement and chatter, grew quieter. Some performers paused in their setup, some organizers stopped mid-conversation, and even the mocking woman's friends glanced around. Sensing that something was changing, he began with soft, tentative notes. At first they were quiet, almost shy, barely carrying across the hall. The sound was delicate, testing the air, exploring the echo of the space. But slowly, the notes grew more confident. Each movement of his fingers was precise yet fluid, the melody taking shape like a thread weaving through the silence. The people in the hall began to notice. A few glanced at each other, confused. Some stopped their tasks entirely, drawn by the sound. The woman herself froze mid-step, her smirk faltering as she tilted her head, listening more closely than she had ever listened to anyone she considered beneath her. The melody unfolded like a story. It was not flashy or designed to impress. It was full of emotion, of human experience. It carried subtle shades of sorrow, tinges of hope, moments of quiet triumph. The music spoke directly to those who listened, bypassing thoughts and reaching straight into the heart. Some people felt tears forming, though they did not understand why. Some felt chills run down their spine, as though the piano had tapped into something universal, something almost forgotten. Her laughter, which had once been so loud and commanding, was gone. She tried to speak, to mock, but no words came. She felt a strange vulnerability, as though the music had stripped away the armor she had always worn. Her friends shifted uncomfortably beside her, sensing the change but unsure what it meant. The hall was transforming. What had been ordinary moments of rehearsal were now infused with something profound. Everyone, even those who had ignored him for years, was aware that they were witnessing something rare. He played with a focus that seemed almost otherworldly. Each chord, each note was deliberate, carrying weight beyond its sound. He remembered the nights of solitude, when only the piano had been his companion. He remembered performing in grand halls, feeling the audience hold its breath at the first note. He remembered losing everything he had loved and turning to music as a refuge. That memory poured through his fingers, filling the room with a depth of feeling that could not be faked or taught. The woman took a small step back. She had never expected him to play like this. She had assumed mockery was enough, that his silence and modest role as a janitor proved his inferiority. But now she could feel her assumptions crumble, as if the walls of her certainty were being broken by invisible force. She could not look away, could not interrupt the flow of sound, could not deny the truth that was unfolding in front of her. Around her, the reactions were subtle but unmistakable. People's movements had slowed. Some leaned forward, resting on tables or chairs, drawn by the melody. Some whispered softly to themselves, almost in disbelief. Others felt their hearts tighten, as if the music had opened doors inside them they had long closed. The janitor did not play for recognition or to prove anyone wrong. He played because it was the only way he could express the emotions that had been held inside him for years. The only way he could communicate the depth of his own experiences. He moved into a more complex section of the piece. The melody rising and falling with dramatic yet natural flow. Each chord resonated through the hall, filling the space with vibration that could be felt in the chest. The people who had once ignored him now leaned in, some holding their hands to their mouths, unable to speak. The woman tried to maintain composure, but the color had drained from her face. Her smirk was gone. She was no longer laughing. She was confronting a reality she had never expected. Someone she had mocked with ease was capable of breathtaking artistry. He did not look at anyone. He did not need to. His focus was entirely on the music, on each movement of his fingers, on each subtle variation in tone. The hall became a living thing, responding to the sound. Light seemed softer, shadows shifted gently, and the air itself seemed charged. The people in the room, whether they realized it or not, were bound together by the music. They were united in a shared experience that transcended the petty rivalries, judgments, and social hierarchies that usually defined their interactions. Minutes passed without anyone speaking. The melody carried on, unfolding like a conversation between hearts. Some listeners felt memories stir, long-forgotten joys and sorrows surfacing. Some felt empathy for the man at the piano, though they had never known him beyond his janitorial role. He was telling a story without words, and it was impossible to look away or ignore. The woman's friends whispered among themselves, the tone hushed and uncertain. Unsure whether to be amazed, embarrassed, or ashamed, her hands clenched slightly at her sides. She wanted to interrupt, to regain control, to assert the superiority she had once held so easily. But the music would not allow it. It had its own authority, its own quiet insistence. She felt small, not in a humiliating way, but in a humbling one. The arrogance she had carried like armor suddenly seemed foolish and empty. She had underestimated him, as so many others had. The weight of that realization pressed on her chest, unfamiliar and uncomfortable. The melody softened slightly, moving into a section that felt intimate, almost confessional. The janitor's fingers danced lightly across the keys, touching on memories of loss, of struggle, and of quiet resilience. The notes were delicate yet powerful, conveying emotions that could not be captured in conversation. Listeners found themselves holding their breath, caught in the fragility and beauty of the moment. Even those who had entered the hall distracted or skeptical were now fully present, their attention entirely captured. He finished the piece without fanfare, letting the final notes linger in the air like a whisper. The hall remained silent for several seconds, as if the music itself had paused time. People blinked slowly, adjusting to the sudden absence of sound. A few exhaled in relief, some felt tears slip down their cheeks, and the woman who had mocked him remained frozen, her arms still crossed. Her eyes wide with shock and something akin to respect, he closed the piano lid carefully, almost reverently, and rose from the bench. There was no smile, no dramatic gesture, only calm. Only quiet dignity. He returned to his duties, picking up the mop and bucket once more, moving with the same measured care he had always shown. But the room had changed. No one would look at him the same way again. Even the woman, who had entered with mockery and arrogance, now understood something she could not deny. She had witnessed a truth that was undeniable. The janitor, quiet and unassuming, held a gift that demanded attention, respect, and admiration. And though she could not fully articulate what she felt, she knew she had been shown a lesson she would never forget. The hall, now buzzing softly with whispers of amazement and curiosity, had been transformed. What had begun as a routine morning of preparation and mockery had become a moment that none present would forget. The janitor moved silently, steadily, his work continuing, but his presence was no longer invisible. He had reminded everyone that true talent, true depth, and true power often hide in places no one bothers to look. And in that quiet victory, he found something he had long thought lost: the acknowledgement that he mattered. Not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it through years of patience, skill, and unwavering commitment to the music that had never left him. The hall had grown quiet in a way that felt almost sacred. The noise of people moving about, adjusting instruments, and chatting had faded into a soft hum, replaced by the lingering presence of music that still seemed to vibrate in the air. He had returned to his cleaning, picking up the mop and bucket, moving carefully along the polished floor. Yet the attention had subtly shifted. People were no longer merely ignoring him, they were watching, waiting. Something about the way he had played had unsettled the usual rhythm of the hall, and even those who tried to act nonchalant could not fully look away. She stood near the edge of the room, arms crossed, her expression a mix of disbelief and unease. She had come expecting to dominate the space, to make others laugh at the sight of the janitor, to confirm the superiority she had always felt over anyone who seemed smaller, quieter, or less important. Instead, she had witnessed something entirely unexpected. The music he had played earlier had spoken in a way words could not. It had revealed depth, emotion, and skill that she could not ignore. She tried to mask her reaction, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, clearing her throat. But the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. She had underestimated him, and she knew it. The janitor moved closer to the piano again, though he had not planned it. It was as if the instrument itself was calling to him, whispering that there was more to be said, more to express. He brushed his fingers lightly over the keys, feeling their smoothness beneath his touch. The music he had played earlier had been only a prelude, a way to remind himself, and those who doubted him, of the quiet power he carried. Now, he was ready to let the melody flow fully. To fill the hall with the depth of feeling he had carried for years, he began again, this time with a richer, more deliberate melody. The notes were stronger, more confident, yet still delicate enough to capture the subtle emotions hidden in the air. The hall seemed to lean closer, as though the walls themselves wanted to hear. People who had been walking or talking paused mid-step, their attention drawn entirely to the music. Some clutched their hands to their chests, moved by the emotions it stirred. Others had tears forming in their eyes, unable to explain why a simple arrangement of keys could move them so deeply. The woman who had mocked him earlier felt her own heart tighten with each note. She had always relied on appearances and assumptions to measure people, to control the social landscape around her. But now faced with the undeniable truth of his skill, she had no choice but to confront her own misjudgment. The arrogance she had carried so effortlessly felt suddenly fragile. She shifted uneasily, unable to look away, trapped by a growing awareness that she had been entirely wrong. Her friends noticed her reaction and followed her gaze, their laughter long gone, replaced by a mixture of shock and admiration. He played with a quiet intensity, his fingers moving across the keys with precision and emotion. Each chord told a story, each pause held weight, each rise and fall of the melody spoke of something deeply human. The music was no longer merely a test or a demonstration, it had become a bridge connecting him to everyone present. It reached beyond words, beyond judgment, into the hearts of those who were willing to listen. People felt the vibrations in their bones, in their chests, in places they could not name, and they were compelled to pay attention. He did not glance at anyone. He did not seek validation. The music was not a weapon, nor was it a performance meant to humble others. It was the truth of his life, laid bare in sound. He had spent years hidden in the background, unseen and unappreciated, yet he had never stopped playing. The piano had been his refuge, his companion, the one thing that remained constant when everything else had fallen away. And now, it was speaking for him, letting the world see a part of him that could no longer remain in shadow. The woman stepped closer, drawn involuntarily by the sound. Her arms unfolded slowly, her posture softening as she tried to make sense of what she was hearing. She had expected mockery, spectacle, or failure. Instead, she encountered mastery, emotion, and an undeniable human presence. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that power did not always come from loudness, status, or appearance. It could come from quiet, unassuming people, from those who carried their skill and their story with dignity and patience. Around the hall, others began to react more openly. Some nodded slowly, as if acknowledging an invisible truth. Some whispered to each other, uncertain whether to speak aloud, sharing observations that were more awe than commentary. Even the organizers and staff who had ignored him for years now regarded him with a new respect. The janitor, once a background figure, had become the center of attention without demanding it. His presence was quiet, yet it dominated the room in a way that words never could. The melody grew more complex, intertwining layers of harmony and emotion. It was as if he were telling a story without words, a story of loss, resilience, longing, and hope. The notes rose and fell like waves, filling the hall with a living, breathing energy. Each person listening felt the music touch them personally, as though it were speaking directly to their own experiences. The woman's friends had stopped talking entirely, held in the spell of the performance. Even those who had been skeptical or dismissive found themselves drawn in. Unable to resist the power of what they were hearing, she felt an unfamiliar sensation, a mixture of humility, admiration, and regret. She had judged too quickly, relied on appearances, and assumed superiority without understanding. Now, confronted with someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting a craft in silence, she felt small. But it was a smallness that brought clarity, a recognition that true talent and dedication could exist anywhere, hidden beneath the surface. She could no longer dismiss him or the music. She had no choice but to acknowledge it. He continued playing, each note deliberate, each chord precise. He was fully absorbed, lost in the act of creating, yet acutely aware of the effect it had on the room. He could feel the tension, the awe, the subtle shift in perception. People were changing before his eyes, their attitudes softening, their judgments fading. The music was doing what words never could, bridging the gap between assumptions and reality, teaching a lesson in patience, humility, and respect. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours in the suspended time of the hall. The melody shifted into a softer, more intimate section, almost like a conversation whispered directly to each listener. The janitor's fingers moved with gentle precision, evoking memories and emotions in everyone present. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. Some held their hands to their faces, trying to hold back tears. Some simply stood, motionless, caught in the spell of the moment. The woman, now fully silent, took an involuntary step back. She could no longer maintain the air of superiority she had carried so easily before. Her arms had fallen to her sides, her posture relaxed but tense, as if she were trying to steady herself against the unexpected power of the music. She could feel her own emotions rising, her own preconceptions shattering. She had expected to mock, to assert dominance, to amuse herself at the expense of another. Instead, she was confronted with undeniable truth and beauty. He moved into the final section of the piece, a culmination of everything he had expressed so far. The notes became more resonant, the chords richer, the melody soaring. The hall seemed to vibrate with the sound, each listener feeling the music in their chest, their bones, their very being. It was impossible to ignore. People leaned forward, some holding their breath, some pressing their hands together in awe. The woman could do nothing but watch, her mind struggling to reconcile what she had assumed with the undeniable reality before her. The janitor's hands danced over the keys. Precise, yet fluid, controlled, yet expressive. He was fully immersed, creating not for recognition, not for revenge, not for any audience, but simply because it was who he was. The music flowed from him naturally, effortlessly, a product of years of practice, loss, reflection, and resilience. The hall was alive with it. Every person present touched, changed in ways they did not yet fully understand.